On your screen is the world champion Domaraju Gukesh, the 18-year-old, looking at the position very intently. He's facing the strongest player on the planet, Magnus Carlsen. They shake hands. Gukesh in his red jacket, looking very smart. Magnus takes off his white jacket and takes his chair. He pours himself some water and he's ready for the fight. The pieces are scrambled on the last rank. That's the freestyle chess for you. This is the first leg in Weissenhaus and Gukesh opens the game with f4. You can see that he makes some space for the queen, gets his knight out, but already this has some repercussions. Because later on when white would want to castle, the king's diagonal would be slightly exposed. Magnus takes his time. It's 10 minutes plus 10 seconds increment. And now, what is the move that he's going to decide to play here? He plays b6. He opens up the bishop on this diagonal. And Gukesh plays b3. He opens up the bishop on another diagonal here. And now Magnus plays this really beautiful move, knight at 6. Why is this amazing? Because he wants to play g6 and trade off these bishops here. Knight comes out to f3. And Magnus plays g6. Gukesh trades off the bishop. Queen takes. And now you can see that here the queen has a very nice diagonal. But Gukesh plays g3. He wants to trade off the other bishops as well. And now pawn to c5. Magnus gains some space in the center of the board. And Gukesh pushes his pawn to e3. Opening up the queen. Maybe wanting to give a check. The knight comes to c7. Defending the square on a6. And Gukesh brings his knight out. He's controlling the center with his knights. And Magnus pushes the pawn to f6. Just taking control of that square. Knight comes to f2. And now the knight comes back to f7. Gukesh expands in the center here. And Magnus has to decide what to do with his central pawns. He pushes forward f5. His point is if you push forward e5, then he'll break with d6. So Gukesh brings his queen to e2. But now Magnus strikes in the center and you can see how all the 4 pawns are now facing each other. There's a lot of stress in the position. F takes e5, taken here by Magnus. He takes back, Magnus takes back, knight takes e5. And he takes the knight. Queen takes. And there's a small pin here. So Gukesh can go knight d3. But instead, he castles here. So you see he's castled short side. The king goes like in the normal game of chess to g1. But maybe Magnus has a very strong move now. Making use of the pin. He goes d5. d4 by Gukesh. What a classy move. If you take with the pawn, I have knight d3 followed by e5. But instead he takes with the queen. E takes f5. G takes f5. Rook comes to the center. The queen moves back. And now Gukesh thinking a bit. He has 3 minutes 50 seconds. Magnus has 5 minutes on the clock. But what essentially Gukesh has done now with knight to h3 is that for one pawn, f5 pawn is weak. He has the f4 square for his knight. Rook comes to f8. And white has enough compensation. c4. I love this move. Because now he's trying to trade off the bishop as well. Long castle has been done. And Gukesh brings his knight to the center of the board. He's looking at all these squares with his knight. Rook comes to e8, attacking the queen. And Gukesh plays his queen to d3. He could have also thought about bringing his queen to h5. He pushes his pawn right into the center of the board. Magnus Carlsen, he now has a protected passer. But first the bishops are traded. Knight takes on a8. And now he chops off the pawn. Queen comes to d7, blocking the check. Now you can keep the queen on the board with queen h5. But instead he takes. And Magnus deciding whether to take with the rook. He takes with the rook. Knight jumps into d5, threatening a fork here. And we have a very nice imbalance on the board. Magnus has a protected passer in the center, while Gukesh has a kingside majority here. He brings his rook into the center. They trade rooks. And now Magnus brings his knight here. If you trade the knights, this should most likely end in a draw. But instead Gukesh keeps the knights because he wants to maybe blockade with his knight on d3 and fight in this endgame. Rook e5 played. Gukesh fighting here for the full point, it seems. He wants to win here. And he's also looking at the other games because this is the last game of the round robin phase. If he finishes in top 8, he qualifies to the knockouts. Or else he would be knocked out. Knight goes to e8. Knight is coming to f6 or d6. He plays his rook to h6. Knight comes here. And you can see how Magnus always keeps improving his pieces. Knight to d5, attacking the rook. Ooh, he brings his knight back, then places it again. The nice point here is if you play d3, I have knight takes e7, d2, check. King takes and knight f5 with the knight coming back. So he goes rook f7, knight to f6, king goes to d8. And now the knight has to go back. The king is a bit cut off. He goes knight f5. Rook comes to the center of the board. The king moves up and now rook f6 would be very, very decent move. The position is equal, but instead he goes back. This is not the best move here by Gukesh. And the king comes up. Slowly and steadily, it feels like Magnus is taking over the control. Gukesh pins the knight here. But b5, what a nice move here. Just shaking up the roots of the position. King f1, he takes, pawn takes. Now the c4 pawn can become weak with king e5 and knight d6. He does go king e5, fantastic move. And Gukesh plays his king to e1. Knight d6, hitting here. Maybe knight f4 is the best move. He finds it. It's an excellent move. If you take knight c4, I have knight d3 check, king e6 and knight takes c5. So he plays rook c7. He brings his rook check, king f5. And now knight comes to d5. This is a mistake because now rook b7 entering here with the rook is very powerful. Magnus finds it. What a nice move here. Now c4 is hanging. The rook has been protected. Knight e4 is coming in. He pushes his pawn to h3, but this is not going to work out now. Knight takes c4, but even stronger is to just bring your knight into the center with e4, knight e4. Magnus takes his time. He knows he's winning here. And he jumps in, knight to e4, and he just sort of punches the knight on the e4 square. He knows he's going to beat the first ever encounter between him and the world champion, king e5. And now there's just no way to stop this check. Because if you see, both the flight squares have been taken away. So he goes rook king f1, d3 played, rook moves back. And now it's time to enter with the rook. No, with the king. He enters king d4. He's attacking the c4 pawn. And Gukesh resigns. Magnus Carlsen wins the game. Very intense game there. Gukesh fighting with all his might. He wanted to beat Magnus, but of course when it comes to the end game, it's very difficult to outwit Magnus. He is the GOAT of endgame. And with this win, Gukesh just barely made it to the top 8 position. So he has qualified to the knockouts. But Magnus Carlsen manages to get the first win against the world champion. We'll see if they cross their swords against each other in the quarterfinals, semifinals or the finals. But for now, I hope you enjoyed the game of the first ever freestyle chess battle between Magnus Carlsen and Gukesh in 2025.